there, and welcome into another edition of the JayMac Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here with us as we answer a very important question. We want to get to the bottom of whether or not this recent decision here in Salt Lake City from Sim Gill, Salt Lake County District Attorney, regarding a police shooting with the suspect, Bernardo Palacios Carbajal, whether or not it was justified. Now, a lot of people thought that it was not justified because they took to the streets on Thursday here in Salt Lake City and they protested, and I'm going to use the R word, they rioted, because they did commit acts of violence, they damaged property, and so we need to get to the bottom of this. Was this shooting justified or not? That will be the content of today's podcast. Before we get to that, I want to thank C. Wilson Nurse for becoming a patron and making a monthly donation to help fund this podcast and help me bring fearless honesty to you every single day. If you would like to donate $1 a month, $5 a month, $10, $25, whatever you can do to help support this podcast, you can click on the link in the podcast description, go to the Podbean app, or just go to my Facebook page and you'll see the link there. All right, so here's what I want to do. I want to tell you what happened according to all of the video evidence and describe the scene for you so that we can then decide whether or not this shooting was justified. Now, the protests and the riots started because Sim Gill, Salt Lake County District Attorney, came out with his decision.
We declined to file criminal charges against either officer for his use of deadly force.
Now, this has people upset because what they've seen is a video of a suspect running away from police and police shooting the suspect as he runs away. So it seems like it would be pretty cut and dry. I don't think it's cut and dry. I think that you have to obviously look at the law and you have to put yourself in the place of these police officers. And we really have to ask the question about what we're asking them to do. And is it reasonable what you're asking them to do? So let's dive in. This happened where it started out with 2 phone calls to 911, 2 reports of armed robbery in the same area. So police, of course, rush to the scene and they see the suspect. And the suspect immediately starts to run away and refuses to comply. They tell the suspect to get down, to stop running. They give something like 17 different commands, and the suspect refuses to do so. Now, initially, police are not sure if the suspect is armed. You can hear on the police radio that an officer believes he's armed, but as the suspect is running away, he trips and falls twice, and then a third time. And the third time that he trips and falls, officers can hear and see clearly that the suspect is armed, carrying a gun. Now, we know after the fact that the gun was loaded and that there was a bullet in the chamber. The police officers could not have known that. And so we have to judge the situation on what they could know at the time. And what they did know is that this individual was not complying with commands, and that every time the individual tripped and dropped the gun, that instead of leaving the gun behind and listening to the police commands to drop the gun, that the suspect picked up the weapon again and again.
The desire to retrieve the gun was greater than the desire to run away.
Again, this is Salt Lake County District Attorney Sim Gill. He said, "I cannot ignore the fact that the urge and desire and the need to hold on to the gun was greater than the desire to flee away from them, because he wasted precious time looking for that gun. If he had left it, the officer said that the imminence of the threat would have been abated for them, and they would not have used that force. When they confirmed that the gun is there, that is when the decision was made to fire." Now, again, you have to put yourself in a police situation where they have to make a split-second decision. Now, these are real people, and I know that we don't look at police officers as though they're real people, but they're in the heat of the moment, and they have to make split-second decisions. Now, what the protesters, I guess, are asking is that no matter what, you have to wait until the weapon is turned and is facing you before you fire your weapon. And I don't think that in some cases that is reasonable, nor does the law require that in some cases. And if you read the law, it doesn't require it in this case. So after the third time that the suspect picks up the gun, the officers decide to open fire, and the suspect goes down. Now, at this point, the suspect could comply and follow police commands, even though the suspect is shot. But according to the video evidence, it appears that the suspect grabs the gun, rolls over, and aims the weapon at police officers. And at this point, they open fire a second time. So you have a situation where you are asking police, again, to make this split-second decision, and they decide that it is an imminent threat to themselves and to everybody else, and that's why they open fire.
The bar's letting out. There's people in the parking lot. There's people across the street. There's traffic.
And so, again, here's Sim Gill describing the decision that police officers are asked to make. Now, both police officers said that they would not have opened fire had the suspect left the weapon behind. But because the suspect kept reaching for the gun, because there were reports of armed robbery in the area, they felt that the threat had to be neutralized. Now, I know that what we don't want, and I believe this, and it's something the protesters say, and it's something the family members are saying, that you don't want police officers to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. You want there to be a trial. And in every case possible, there should be a trial. And police should not carry out their own punishment. And in the case of George Floyd, I could not see why the police were acting and behaving the way that they were. But in this case of the Salt Lake City shooting, I can absolutely put myself in the place of a police officer, and I can absolutely say that it is not reasonable for them to have to wait for the suspect to turn around. I think that if you add up all of the evidence that was going through their minds at that split-second decision, let me see, there were 2 calls of armed robbery in the area. We have a suspect running. The suspect has fallen down and dropped the weapon several times, but still picks it up. Now, one officer yells, "Tase him." And that officer was asked later on, why do you now support that the guns were used, that the suspect was shot instead of tased? And that officer said, well, I said tase him when he had dropped the gun. But once he dropped the weapon, using a taser with an armed individual who has a gun, that math doesn't work. That equation doesn't work. The other question was asked, well, why were so many shots fired? Well, that's for 2 reasons. A, police are trained, and we can talk about the training that they receive, but police are trained to neutralize the suspect at that moment. If you're going to fire your weapon, it's because you believe it's their life or yours, or the life of people around you or yours. So at that point, you're not trying to wound. You are literally trying to kill. And if you disagree with that, maybe that's some of the police reform that should happen. I believe that if a police officer has decided that the threat is so strong that they need to shoot, then they do need to shoot to kill. And if you look at any facts surrounding guns, you know that just because somebody has been shot, that does not mean that they're neutralized. So when I do the math, everything that I see in this particular situation, I agree with the determination of Sim Gill that this was an imminent threat. They had enough evidence to believe that their lives or the lives of other people were at risk. And unfortunately, that meant that this individual would be shot. And I hate that. I hate that. I hate it for the family. I understand why the family would be upset. They see this video of their son running away, and they believe that the shots were fired in the back when there was no threat. But there was a threat. There was an imminent threat here. And sometimes you make choices that take away your right to a jury trial. And I believe that that's what happened here. And I think that there's another thing that needs to be answered. For those of you who are out saying that we need to defund the police, I want you to look at what we know about this circumstance. Now, we've judged these officers in the heat of the moment, and there are things that they could not have known in the moment. So we can't judge their actions based upon what we found out after the fact. But we can judge how we should view the need for police officers after the fact. So what we know from the facts is that the suspect was actually the individual who was committing the armed robberies. We know this because the individual who he had robbed had an ID and cash, and that was found on the suspect. So we know that the suspect was committing armed robbery. We know that. Now, for those of you who want to defund the police, what is your suggestion for how our society should respond to somebody out committing armed robbery? What is your suggestion? The reason that the armed robberies stopped, 2 of them happened in the same area. Who knows how many more would have happened? Who knows if any of those would have turned into somebody getting killed by the suspect? I'm just curious. What is your solution when there is an armed robber? And that's what this guy was. We know it. Again, we can't judge the police officer's actions based upon what we know after the fact, but we can judge how we believe police should respond and whether or not there should be a police department. In this case, the armed robberies stopped because the police responded. If there was no police force, or if they had to send out social workers or somebody else, how does the situation play out? And again, I feel horrible for the family, but somebody's got to say it. I mean, your son is out committing armed robbery. What is your expectation? I know you want him to have a trial. I know you want him to have a chance to plead his case. But at some point, your choices add up. They stack up. And there are consequences for those choices. And I'm sorry for your loss, but there are consequences to choices. And sometimes you create a situation where the threat is so imminent that you're not going to have an opportunity for a jury trial. Why? Because of your own choices. He chose to do certain things in the heat of the moment that led to this. And I just think it's an unreasonable expectation to think that police are going to deal with an armed suspect who is not responding to commands in such a way that they wait until the bullets are coming in their direction. I just don't think that is reasonable. Now, from there, Sim Gill says that we can have a second conversation about criminal justice reform. We can have a second conversation about police brutality and those concerns that are there. If you know me and you've listened to my podcast and my show, you know that I have come down against the actions of police officers in several of the police brutality shootings that we've seen. But in this case, I'm going to side with the police officers. And I believe that in the heat of the moment and according to laws, they did the right thing. So Sim Gill didn't say what that second conversation should be or what those changes should be. To me, there's only a question of where you draw the line in this case. Do you send police officers out when there's an armed robbery? Yeah, I think you do. So then the question is, at what point can a police officer use deadly force? Do they have to wait until the gun is pointed in their direction? Or can they, based upon a preponderance of the evidence in that particular moment, make a decision that there is an imminent threat to themselves or other people? I think that you have to allow for that. And if you don't, then who would ever be a police officer? I mean, who would want that job? So I think in this case, we have to stand on the side of police officers and lament and regret that the suspect made certain choices that night that led to him losing his life. And I think that that's very sad. And I hate to see that. But that's the reality of choices in our society. Now, let's move on and talk a little bit about the protesters. And I'm going to call them rioters, not protesters. And I'm sure that there were those on Thursday night that just carried their signs and acted peacefully. But the description of the media is that this group was pretty hostile from the very beginning. And when you decide to deface government property with red paint, when you decide to break out windows, you are no longer a protester in my book. You are a rioter. And what these protesters fail to understand is that when they choose anarchy, they completely distract from the real issue because everybody starts focusing on the anarchy and they stop talking about what really happened. And Sim Gill even talked about this.
To the protesters, I say, you exercise your First Amendment right. I support that. I believe in that. I protested myself.
What was interesting to me was that there were signs at the protests, I don't know if you saw them, that said, "This is what democracy looks like." If you were carrying those signs and you were peacefully protesting, then you're right. That's what democracy looks like. But if you were carrying those signs and then you participated in the defacing of public property and the breaking of windows, that's not what democracy looks like. That's what anarchy looks like. And there's a very big difference. Now, I was very glad to see that the violence was stopped and that several people were arrested who were committing acts of violence. That's what should happen in these specific situations. So just again, to the protesters, I think you have to be very careful how you respond, because if you have a knee-jerk reaction or if you choose acts of violence, then you take away the focus of what you're trying to do. And I will consider anything that you have to say. It's what I do. When I see somebody protesting, I don't immediately knee-jerk and say, "Oh, come on, that's not real." I will look into it. I will analyze it. I will do everything in my power to consider it. But when you choose anarchy, it makes it very difficult to look past that. So again, let's try and stay away from that, shall we? So I guess we just need to sum up that my conclusion is this police shooting was justified. I hate it for the family, but sometimes your choices make it so you're not going to get a jury trial. And that's just the way that it is. And when we talk about criminal justice reform to keep a case like this from happening again, what does that reform look like? I'm very curious to know. And when you talk about defunding police or not having police departments, what do you do when an individual is roaming the streets of Salt Lake City and they are committing armed robbery? What do you do?